Chapter 3 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Start. On the morning of April 1st, 1882, our Circle Dot herd started on its long tramp to the Blackfoot Agency in Montana. With 6 men on each side and the herd strung out for 3/4 of a mile, it could only be compared to some mythical serpent or Chinese dragon as it moved forward on its sinuous snail-like course. 2 riders, known as point men, rode out and well back from the lead cattle, and by riding forward and closing in as occasion required, directed the course of the herd. The main body of the herd trailed along behind the leaders like an army in loose marching order, guarded by outriders known as swingmen, who rode well out from the advancing column, warding off range cattle and seeing that none of the herd wandered away or dropped out. There was no driving to do. The cattle moved on their own free will as in ordinary travel. Flood seldom gave orders, but as a number of us had never worked on the trail before, at breakfast on the morning of our start he gave in substance these general directions. Boys, the secret of trailing cattle is never let your herd know that they are under restraint. Let everything that is done be done voluntarily by the cattle. From the moment you let them off the bed ground in the morning until they are bedded at night, never let a cow take a step except in the direction of its destination. In this manner you can loaf away the day and cover from 15 to 20 miles. And the herd in the meantime will enjoy all the freedom of an open range. Of course, it's long, tiresome hours to the men, but the condition of the herd and saddle stock demands sacrifices on our part, if any have to be made. And I want to caution you younger boys about your horses. There is such a thing as having 10 horses in your string and at the same time being afoot. You are all well mounted, and on the condition of the remuda depends the success and safety of the herd. Accidents will happen to horses, but don't let it be your fault. Keep your saddle blankets dry and clean, for no better word can be spoken of a man that he is careful of his horses. Ordinarily a man might get along with 6 or 8 horses, but in such emergencies as we are liable to meet, we have not a horse to spare, and a man afoot is useless. And as all of us younger boys learned afterwards, there was plenty of good solid horse sense in Flood's advice, for before the trip ended there were men in our outfit who were as good as afoot, while others had their original mounts, every one fit for the saddle. Flood had insisted on a good mount of horses, and Lovell was cowman enough to know that what the mule is to the army, the cow horse is to the herd. The first and second day out there was no incident worth mentioning. We traveled slowly, hardly making an average day's drive. The third morning Flood left us to look out a crossing on the Arroyo, Colorado. On coming down to receive the herd, we had crossed this sluggish bayou about 36 miles north of Brownsville. It was a deceptive-looking stream, being over 50 feet deep and between bluff banks. We ferried our wagon and saddle horses over, swimming the loose ones. But the herd was keeping near the coastline for the sake of open country, and it was a question if there was a ford for the wagon as near the coast as our course was carrying us. The murmurings of the Gulf had often reached our ears the day before, and herds had been known, in former years, to cross from the mainland over to Padre Island, the intervening Laguna Madre being fordable. We were nooning when Flood returned with the news that it would be impossible to cross our wagons at any point on the bayou, and that we would have to ford around the mouth of the stream. Where the fresh and salt water meet in the laguna, there had formed a delta or shallow bar, and by following its contour we would not have over 12 to 14 inches of water, though the half circle was nearly 2 miles in length. As we would barely have time to cross that day, the herd was at once started, veering for the mouth of the Arroyo, Colorado. On reaching it about the middle of the afternoon, the foreman led the way, having crossed in the morning and learned the ford. The wagon followed, the saddle horses came next, while the herd brought up the rear. It proved good footing on the sandbar, but the water in the laguna was too salty for the cattle, though the loose horses lay down and wallowed in it. We were about an hour in crossing, and on reaching the mainland met a vaquero who directed us to a large freshwater lake a few miles inland, where we camped for the night. It proved an ideal camp, with wood, water, and grass in abundance, and very little range stock to annoy us. We had watered the herd just before noon, and before throwing them upon the bed ground for the night, watered them a second time. We had a splendid campfire that night of dry, live oak logs, and after supper was over and the first guard had taken the herd, smoking and storytelling were the order of the evening. The campfire is to all outdoor life what the evening fireside is to domestic life. After the labors of the days are over, the men gather around the fire, and the social hour of the day is spent in yarning. The stories told may run from the sublime to the ridiculous, from a true incident to a base fabrication, from a touching bit of pathos to the most vulgar vulgarity. "Have I ever told this outfit my experience with the vigilantes when I was a kid?" inquired Bull Durham. There was a general negative response, and he proceeded. "Well, our folks were living on the Frio at the time, and there was a man in our neighborhood who had an outfit of 4 men out beyond Nueces Canyon hunting wild cattle for their hides. It was necessary to take them out supplies about every so often, and on one trip he begged my folks to let me go along for company. I was a slim slip of a colt, about 14 at the time, and as this man was a friend of ours, my folks consented to let me go along. We each had a good saddle horse and 2 pack mules with provisions and ammunition for the hunting camp. The first night we made camp, a boy overtook us with the news that the brother of my companion had been accidentally killed by a horse, and of course he would have to return. Well, we were 20 miles on our way, and it would take some little time to go back and return with the loaded mules. I volunteered, like a fool kid, to go on and take the packs through. The only question was, could I pack and unpack? I had helped him at this work, double-handed, but now that I was to try it alone, he showed me what he called a squaw hitch, with which you can lash a pack single-handed. After putting me through it once or twice, and satisfying himself that I could do the packing, he consented to let me go on, he and the messenger returning home during the night. The next morning I packed without any trouble and started on my way. It would take me 2 days yet, poking along with heavy packs to reach the hunters. Well, I hadn't made over 8 or 10 miles that first morning, when, as I rounded a turn in the trail, a man stepped out from behind a rock, threw a gun in my face, and ordered me to hold up my hands. Then another appeared from the opposite side with his gun leveled on me. Inside half a minute, a dozen men galloped up from every quarter, all armed to the teeth. The man on leaving had given me his gun for company, one of these old smoke pole cap and ball 6-shooters. But I must have forgotten what guns were for I elevated my hands nicely. The leader of the party questioned me as to who I was and what I was doing there, and what I had in those packs. That once, at least, I told the truth. Every mother's son of them was cursing and cross-questioning me in the same breath. They ordered me off my horse, took my gun, and proceeded to verify my tale by unpacking the mules. So much ammunition aroused their suspicion, but my story was as good as it was true, and they never shook me from the truth of it. I soon learned that robbery was not their motive, and the leader explained the situation. A vigilance committee had been in force in that county for some time, trying to rid the county of lawless characters. But lawlessness got into the saddle and had bench warrants issued and served on every member of this vigilance committee. As the vigilantes numbered several hundred, There was no jail large enough to hold such a number, so they were released on parole for appearance at court. When court met, every man served with a capias. Hold your horses just a minute," interrupted Quince Forrest. "I want to get that word. I want to make a memorandum of it, for I may want to use it myself sometime. Capias. Now I have it. Go ahead." When court met, every man served with a bench warrant from the judge presiding was present, and as soon as court was called to order, a squad of men arose in the courtroom, and the next moment the judge fell riddled with lead. Then the factions scattered to fight it out, and I was passing through the county while matters were active. They confiscated my gun and all the ammunition in the packs, but helped me to repack and started me on my way. A happy thought struck one of the men to give me a letter which would carry me through without further trouble, but the leader stopped him, saying, "Let the boy alone. Your letter would hang him as sure as hell's hot before he went 10 miles farther." I declined the letter. Even then I didn't have sense enough to turn back, and inside of 2 hours I was rounded up by the other faction. I had learned my story perfectly by this time, and those packs had to come off again for everything to be examined. There was nothing in them now but flour and salt and such things, nothing that they might consider suspicious. One fellow in this second party took a fancy to my horse and offered to help hang me on general principles, but kinder counsels prevailed. They also helped me to repack, and I started on once more. But before I reached my destination the following evening, I was held up 7 different times. I got so used to it that I was happily disappointed every shelter I passed, if some man did not step out and throw a gun in my face. I had trouble to convince the cattle hunters of my experiences, but the absence of any ammunition, which they needed worst, at last led them to give credit to my tale. I was expected home within a week, as I was to go down on the Nueces on a cow hunt which was making up, and I only rested 1 day at the hunters' camp. On their advice, I took a different route on my way home, leaving the mules behind me. I never saw a man the next day returning, and was feeling quite gala on my good fortune. When evening came on, I sighted a little ranch house some distance off the trail, and concluded to ride to it and stay overnight. As I approached, I saw that someone lived there, as there were chickens and dogs about, but not a person in sight. I dismounted and knocked on the door, when, without a word, the door was thrown wide open, and half a dozen guns were poked into my face. I was ordered into the house and given a chance to tell my story again. Whether my story was true or not, they took no chances on me, but kept me all night. One of the men took my horse to the stable and cared for him, and I was well fed and given a place to sleep, but not a man offered a word of explanation, from which I took it they did not belong to the vigilance faction. When it came time to go to bed, one man said to me, "Now, sonny, don't make any attempt to get away, and don't move out of your bed without warning us, for you'll be shot as sure as you do. We won't harm a hair on your head if you're telling us the truth, only do as you're told, for we'll watch you." By this time I had learned to obey orders while in that county, and got a fair night's sleep, though there were men going and coming all night. The next morning I was given my breakfast. My horse, well cuffed and saddled, was brought to the door, and with his parting advice I was given permission to go. "Son, if you've told us the truth, don't look back when you ride away. You'll be watched for the first 10 miles after leaving here, and if you've lied to us, it will go hard with you. Now remember, don't look back, for these are times when no one cares to be identified." I never questioned that man's advice. It was "die dog or eat the hatchet" with me. I mounted my horse, waved the usual parting courtesies, and rode away. As I turned into the trail about a quarter of a mile from the house, I noticed 2 men ride out from behind the stable and follow me. I remembered the story about Lot's wife looking back, though it was lead and not miracles that I was afraid of that morning. For the first hour I could hear the men talking and the hoofbeats of their horses as they rode along always the same distance behind me. After about 2 hours of this one-sided joke, as I rode over a little hill, I looked out of the corner of my eye back at my escort, still about a quarter of a mile behind me. One of them noticed me and raised his gun, but I instantly changed my view, and the moment the hill hid me, put spurs to my horse, so that when they reached the brow of the hill I was a half a mile in the lead, burning the earth like a caned dog. They threw lead close around me, but my horse lengthened the distance between us for the next 5 miles, when they dropped entirely out of sight. By noon I came into the old stage road, and by the middle of the afternoon reached home after over 60 miles in the saddle without a halt. Just at the conclusion of Bull's story, Flood rode in from the herd, and after picketing his horse, joined the circle. In reply to an inquiry from one of the boys as to how the cattle were resting, he replied, "The herd is breaking into trail life nicely. If we'll just be careful with them now for the first month, and no bad storms strike us in the night, we may never have a run the entire trip. That last drink of water they had this evening gave them a nightcap that'll last them until morning. No, there's no danger of any trouble tonight." For fully an hour after the return of our foreman, we lounged around the fire, during which time there was a full and free discussion of stampedes. But finally Flood, suiting the action to the word by arising, suggested that all hands hunt their blankets and turn in for the night. A quiet wink from Bull to several of the boys held us for the time being, and innocently turning to Forrest, Durham inquired, Was it you that was telling someone about a run you were in last summer? I never heard you tell it. Where was it?" "You mean on the Cimarron last year when we mixed 2 herds," said Quince, who had taken the bait like a bass and was now fully embarked on a yarn. "We were in rather close quarters, herds ahead and behind us, when one night here came a cow herd like a cyclone and swept right through our camp. We tumbled out of our blankets and ran for our horses, but before we could bridle, Bull had given us the wink, and every man in the outfit fell back, and the snoring that checked the storyteller was like a chorus of ripsaws running through pine knots." Forrest took in the situation at a glance, and as he arose to leave, looked back and remarked, "You must all think that's smart." Before he was out of hearing, Durham said to the rest of us, "A few doses like that will cure him of sucking eggs and acting smart," interrupting folks. End of chapter 3.